In the previous video I used my mould to pour a bunch of casts of my zombie sculpture, so in this video I'm going to look at painting them up. Now I had mentioned that these are available in my Etsy store in the previous video, and I'd like to thank everybody who's actually bought a copy, and it's really nice to have some support, so thank you very much. My fiancée is a tattooist, as I may have mentioned in a previous video, and her studio invited me to come along to the Great British Tattoo Convention and have a few sculptures on her stand. So all of these were painted in anticipation of the event. It was quite nice to get some of my sculptures out in public for a change, and I'll certainly be doing some more events later in the year. So the approach I'm using here is to attempt to create a layered paint job on this. So the first thing I'm doing is to paint in some very thin veins onto the sculpture. As you can see in the one I've already done here, the idea is to try and get a very subtle look whereby we have regular sort of skin colours on top, but there's a faint impression on veins and blood and other skin artifacts going on underneath the surface. So it's really trying to layer washes of paint one on top of the other, and hopefully at the end we'll get all of these things to come together into something that looks like a realistic skin texture. So having painted the veins in, what you can now see here is I'm dabbing in blobs of red all over the sculpture. Now this being a zombie, I'm trying to give it a sort of a mottled skin look, so I'm not being particularly consistent here. I'm just putting patches of red all over the place. So as you can see, hopefully what I've got here is a sort of fairly subtle addition of colour here, so it's not too strong overall, although there are some blotches here and there. I kind of like that. I mean, it's dead flesh, so you kind of expect it to look a bit blotchy and sort of not quite uniform, I suppose you might say. But hopefully the colour scheme here is quite subtle, and I don't want to make it too strong. So the next thing to do here is to add some additional colours. So now I'm coming in with some blues. Now blue is a colour that I never really associate with being in skin too much. I mean, you see it in veins and I suppose bruises, but that's about it. But I've really found, having done this a few times, that adding in blue really does add a lot to skin textures. So what I'm doing here is just doing a similar pass with blue, adding blotches all over the sculpture. And as you can see here, what it's sort of doing is making the sculpture look a little bit bruised, which I guess makes sense. You know, when you get a bruise, it's sort of coagulated blood and burst blood vessels. Now what I'm using here is Tamiya paints, which are a type of acrylic. I'm also using the thinner that Tamiya produces, and I find that this actually produces a very strong paint. It's very difficult to get this stuff off once you've put it on, and that's useful because we're going to be putting lots of layers of paint on. We don't want the layers that you've previously added to move when you start putting ones on top. So this is quite a good approach. You just got to be quite careful not to come in too strong, as if you do add it too strong, it can be a little bit difficult to remove sometimes. So now continuing here and adding in some more green, I figured given that this is a zombie and he's probably starting to rot, he should have some green in there as well. I think this would probably work for if this were a living creature as well. I think there is a touch of green in human skin as well. But for a zombie, I think it's perfectly appropriate, so I'm just adding in another layer of green. What you can also see is I'm using a fan brush to just smooth out the blobs of paint as well. You don't really want any hard edges here, so the fan brush just really helps you smooth those out and make sure that they're not too prominent. So what I've now got to is adding some washes on top. Now what I'm using is an oil paint, and I'm thinning it down with a solvent, which is white spirits, otherwise known as mineral spirits. So as you can see here, I'm just putting on very light washes, and hopefully you can see that's sort of starting to pull all of the previous elements of the paint together and sort of unify them slightly. Because it's so thin and it's thinned with solvent, it's semi-transparent, so you can see the previous colours that you've added on underneath it. And that's sort of the idea. This is sort of like the top level of paints, and the idea being that it's just going to try and tie together all of the elements you've added so far. So that's the basic principle. As I mentioned, I've got about 5 of these casts, so I was able to do a variety of different paint jobs. Here you can see another one that I've started, and at this stage I've done all the initial layers of paint, but I haven't actually added the oil washes on top. Of course, this being a zombie, you've got to have some blood in there, so this is in a sense a bit of one of the more fun elements of doing the paint job. You can add the blood and sort of have it dripping down and doing all sorts of cool stuff with this. So it's a bit of the paint job I think I enjoy the most. So here you can see I'm adding in my oil washes over the base layers of paint that I've added, and as you can see I'm putting in some light layers here, and I'm using a fan brush to just smooth out the paint and make sure that it's sort of evenly distributed over the model. For this one I decided to go for a slightly darker skin tone to the one on the left. I figured zombies might have been in the ground for a while, so they can be all sorts of different colours. So this guy's got a sort of slightly more leathery skin type look, which I quite like. I have to confess actually that the zombie that you can see on the left there was the first one I did, and I spent quite a lot of time trying to replicate that paint job because I really like it, but I just couldn't figure out how I actually did it. So a lot of my zombies ended up coming out quite tanned, like the one that I'm currently painting, rather than looking a bit more flesh-like like the one on the left. Eventually I figured out it's just including thinner paint layers to the one on the left. I think that's probably still my favourite one, although I do like the slightly more tanned ones as well. So because they're zombies you can kind of do whatever you like with these things. The final stage is just the small details, and what I'm doing here is just adding some more brown oil paints to the teeth. What I'm doing is putting a blob of paint on and then smoothing it out with some white spirits, and what that does is to flow into the cavities between the teeth, so that just gives a bit of shading to it and brings out a bit of life to it. I'm also doing the same for other sort of nooks and crannies on the face, just to try and add a degree of shadow and shading and a bit of contrast and definition to the overall look. As you can see here, I'm also coming in with some slightly lighter red oils just to add some highlights to the bloody areas. As you can see, I'm also flicking the sculpture with my paintbrush. That's just to add a little bit of splatter to it and a bit of random variation to the colour. And because I wanted to have some different looks, I started doing an extremely bloody version as well. So this guy's obviously just been eating, so he's covered in blood. It is quite fun to just splatter stuff in blood, but you've got to be careful not to go too far, because before you know it you can just end up with a big red blob, which doesn't really look so good. So try not to go too heavy with the blood if you do try and have a go with this. Now for the bases of the sculpture, what I decided to do was give them a layer of white spray paint. Now the resin that I've used is a almost white resin, but it's not pure white. There's a sort of a slightly creamy colour to it, I suppose. So what I figured I could do was just give it a light dusting of white paint, and that would cause the highlights, the raised edges of the base to be white, while the crevices, the indentations would remain slightly off-white. So that would give a degree of variation in colour to it. What I then did was to come in with some oil paints and give the bases several washes of oils, so the browns and the blacks flowed into the crevices and the indentations of the base, adding some shadow and some shading to it. So the bases were fairly easy to do. So here are my painted zombies. I'm quite pleased with how these have come out. There's a fair degree of variation to them, as you can see. I think in future ones I might actually have a go at being even more varied. I thought it'd be quite fun to do a clown zombie. So the idea would be to paint one up, as you can see, then to add makeup and some clown hair and maybe the remnants of a big red nose, something like that. So there's quite a lot you can do with these things, so I think that would be quite fun. Might even be fun to add some sort of ragged clothing to one, perhaps, just to make it look like he's had all his clothes torn up. Anyway, that's it from me. I hope this has been useful if you're painting one of your own models, or even if you've bought one of my zombie sculptures. Thanks for doing so, but I hope this is useful if you do come to paint it. So that's it. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.